Hello and welcome to Startup Week, day 3. We're in the second half of the week now, so hopefully all of you have had some good sessions to attend. Before we kick things off, I just want to welcome all of you. Denver Startup Week only happens because of you. This is the largest free startup convention in the world, and it's cool to see everyone back in person. We're remote for a while. This venue, the product track, we've been struggling a little bit with acoustics, so if you guys struggle hearing anything at any point in time, wave at the panelists, wave at me. There are plenty of seats up here, so encourage you to move forward too if that becomes a problem. We kind of dual mic situation happening. But with that, I do want to thank our sponsors that make all of this happen. So Amazon, our presenting sponsor, Capital One, Dell, of course, and Downtown Denver Partnership. Pi Insurance is actually our product track sponsor, so special shout out to them. Lots of sponsors make this happen, again, so it can be free for all of us to attend and collaborate. So please support them and shout out to them when possible. Super excited for this next session. We've had a lot of good panels so far on the product track. And yeah, I guess without further ado, I'll let Allegra take it from here.
Hey, everybody. Can everyone in the back hear? Doing good? Okay. Feel free to flag us down if that changes. Cool. We're here today to talk about product discovery. This is something that is near and dear to all of our hearts, hence why we are on the panel today. The way this is going to work, we're going to start with 45, maybe 40 minutes of questions for our panelists. From me, I'm going to be moderating today, and then we'll open the floor to you all. One thing that I think you'll see is really cool with the panelists that we have today is it's really a good mix, both of seniority, title, type of work, industry, type of user as well. Which kicks me off with our first question. I'd love for our panelists to introduce themselves, just a little quick who you are, maybe what industry you're in, and also would love to understand what your user group or groups look like. Direct to consumer, internal, all of that. All right, James, I'll pass it to you.
All right. Can everybody hear me in the back okay? All right, just checking. Awesome. My name is James Heimbuck. I'm Principal Product Manager at GitLab. GitLab is a DevOps platform, so we are B2B primarily. My users are developers. My buyers are developers' bosses and their VPs. So we do a lot of research in both of those areas. Did I cover all of the intro parts?
Yeah.
All right.
Hey everyone, I'm Mary Moreno. I work for Everly Health, formerly known as Everly Well, which is our consumer brand. I am a director of product there, and our customers are primarily on the consumer side, but we do have a B2B business called Everly Health Solutions. I work on the consumer side of the business.
Hi, everybody. My name is Ronnie Powers. Nice to meet you all. Really excited to talk with you today. After a few years in product, I decided to go ahead and take the plunge and found my own company. So I'm the founder and CEO of Pluto Biosciences, which is a B2B life sciences SaaS platform. So similar to James, our end users are scientists, often wet lab biologists, and our buyers are often their bosses, still kind of scientific leadership. So we are B2B, but really excited to talk about product discovery with you all.
Great. I'm Allegra Bishop, your moderator today. I'm a senior product manager at a company called Suna. It is my third day on the job, so I can't answer too many questions about our product quite yet. But it's mainly marketers, small business owners, mostly direct to consumer, but we also do subscription model. We're kind of trying it all. So yeah, happy to be here. Cool. Let's start it off first just with a definition of product discovery and what that means. So product discovery kind of spans all types of different work. Generally speaking, we're talking about the work and research required to make decisions on what to build, what to fix, what to take out for your users and your customers to make sure that they have the best experience possible. We'll probably be talking about a few different types of that research and that discovery today. One type you may have heard of is generative research. Another is evaluative. The best way to think about that, generative is you're generating problems. You're talking to your users without a specific goal, a specific problem you're trying to understand, but really getting a good sense of who your users are, what they care about, and what their needs are. And then evaluative research is more specifically, you know what the problem is, you're trying to make sure that the solution that you've come up with for that problem is appropriate. So it kind of spans all types. But let's go ahead and start with understanding what product discovery looks like at your company. Is it just you? Who tends to lead that? Do you have a dedicated team? If you're one of the very lucky few, Suna has a user researcher, and I am so excited. James, I'll let you go first.
All right. We're really lucky at GitLab because we have dedicated UX researchers. In my area, we have one for our section, which is 8 groups. So they will lead research for us if we have a broad topic or we have a very deep topic that we want to dig into. Generatively, we talk to customers all the time. We have an open roadmap. So I'm interacting with customers in our issues, which is terrifying and super fun at the same time, generating, understanding what those problems look like. And then we have a problem and solution validation track that we go down. Problem validation is primarily led by product with our designer, and then the designer will take and run with that solution validation, which is very evaluative, I would say, ensuring that for the size of the problem that we've found, it fits the workflow for the user, and we get kind of a good 80-20 solution. We know that we can't solve for all of our millions of customers, but we make our best effort.
At Everly, we have a mix of both types of research as well. I like the way you articulated it. Very similar at our organization. We have a couple UX researchers, and I'm similarly very excited to work with them. This is the first job that I've had where it's like a dedicated function. At other companies I've worked at, it is sort of more dispersed or shared with the product managers and UX designers. We are, I would say, a little less structured than you described it. Where we kind of go out and we have ideas that are generated amongst our stakeholder groups or with our leadership teams. And then we go out, talk to customers, validate whether that's a good solution based on the data we're seeing or based on the ideas generated internally. Continue the discovery process that way.
Great, and we have even less structure as a very small startup. So at Pluto, we have 9 employees total that are on our team. So we do not have a dedicated kind of research process or person. But I do think that we incorporate both of those aspects. As a very early stage startup and being only about a year and a half in market, we had to generate a lot of hypotheses ourselves about what people would want. The evaluation process, I think, is really interesting because it's just so tightly connected right now with our sales cycle. We are learning in real time as we're continuing to develop the product. So really tightly knit. That person doing the product discovery and research is often myself or people involved in the sales and also just our engineers. So I think it's really neat actually to get so many disciplines involved in that.
Great. Even better. Before I ask this next question, I would love to know, can you raise your hand if you have a dedicated UX researcher, not a UX designer, but UX researcher at your company? Okay, so maybe like a 6th, a 7th of us? Oh, so lucky. Okay, this is also maybe a selfish question because I am still trying to figure out how to do this with a UX researcher. For James and for Mary, how do you guys balance being a product person with a UX team and also those specific user research folks on your team as well?
I'm going to take this one first. I think we have a good balance at my organization, but it took some time to figure that out, right? Like if you don't have the muscle of like working with a thought partner from a like UX researcher perspective with that like specialized brain, often I found myself at first stepping on toes, or at least feeling like I was stepping on toes, coming up with research questions that I myself as a product manager was like really interested in digging into. But I think the more you work with them and understand like where their unique strengths and weaknesses are, the more you can like fill the gap between them. But on the whole, I would say like our research team will come up with like exercises that might be really useful for us to like ideate around internally with our stakeholder groups. So I work a lot with like the clinical science team, research and development, and our marketing team. We're a at-home diagnostics company, so those are very relevant functions at our company. To generate ideas, problems that we might want to solve for greenfield products or projects, and sort of, we think about like key questions we want to answer, things that I'm curious about from a business like goal standpoint, things like that.
It's tough. No, we're really lucky where we have a lot of structure built into the process. And so we can really leverage our UX researcher to start with a broad question and say, how many people should we talk to? What should that research look like? Tell me why these research questions suck. And they can go and run with it and answer those questions and structure the data and ask the right kinds of questions in a survey or run user experience games, which is a new one that I'd never experienced before. But our researcher right now is playing games with developers to understand how they want to work with our product for a specific problem that we want to understand. So their experience is just great, because then we can think about the business side of things and understand what's the next biggest problem to go tackle, how does it fit into the market, some of the things that we do more naturally as product.
Great. Ronnie, maybe this is for you. This could also be for the other two of you who have maybe been in positions where you don't have those UX resources available. I would love to know how you balance or understand kind of the ratio of time that you as a product person spend doing user research versus all of the other, tasks and responsibilities we have as product folks.
So I think are you able to hear me all still back here? No. Why can everybody hear everybody else but not me? Is that better? Okay. Small voice, I guess. No, so I think, for that question, something that James just mentioned was really interesting too, which is understanding how your users want to interact with your product. That's something that we have, I guess, learned very tangibly recently, in that when users are expecting one thing and then maybe they're seeing something else, that can make a big difference in your sales and in your product. And so, to Allegra's question, I think it's really important to balance the product development with understanding what it is that your users are looking for. So it really is a worthwhile investment of time. Without a regimented process, though, it's hard to kind of keep coming back. And so I think the balance there is actually being organized and kind of documenting. And so that's how we've tried to be really efficient with the research that we've done. But as a product person, I always want to be improving the product, right, and really staying in that. But I think you can, when you tangibly see, especially at a startup, the bottom line on revenue, the bottom line impact that you're having on users, you realize that you really do need to balance those two things. So I think we just try to be organized.
I'll add that when we're doing like wireframes, in a world where I don't have a UX researcher that I'm working with or partnering with, when we're doing things like wireframes or thinking through a solution, that's an opportunity, especially if like the UX designer that I'm working with isn't as comfortable doing things like user testing or putting some ideas in front of users. I always kind of like footnote to myself, like, okay, we should probably put this in front of someone depending on the questions we're asking in those wireframing sessions, right? Like where you're working with the designer, like, oh, well, I don't know if it should be on this side or that side. Like, what do we think the right approach is? Like, okay, maybe this is an opportunity we can use to put something on usertesting.com. So like integrating it into your like discovery practices as much as possible. More from like a testing and like direct to user question process. That's what I would say. But I think like on the whole, I probably spent like 15 to 20% of my time as a product manager working on discovery.
Great. One thing that I really love about Denver Startup Week is there's usually a pretty good call to action at the end of a lot of workshops and events. That's harder in panels sometimes. So this next question is very like call to action. What can people take away from this session? Let's talk a little bit about discovery practices. What are some that you've implemented or you've seen others implement at current or past companies that you thought were really great? And especially, what are some that seemed really shiny, seemed like great ideas, and fell super flat, since this is stories of research and regret?
make sure you know what kind of user you want to talk to and that they actually reflect your user base. I think that's my story of regret. As I was looking at the questions beforehand, was we did research. We did a big survey. We talked to users. It was about a rewards program. In hindsight, the people who will sign up to take a survey because it has an incentive and who want to talk to us because it has an incentive, they really want a rewards program. They weren't our user base. And so it flopped. So we missed because we didn't collaborate or triangulate, are the people we talking to actually representative of the user base? So think about that as you're thinking about your personas. Is that person actually representative of who's using our product today?
I love that answer. And I would add that sometimes companies, and we're all gonna collectively roll our eyes at this, but sometimes companies and leaders say, I really wanna develop an app, let's make an app. And you're like, okay, great, we have a solution and I have to figure out how to solve the problem that this solution already apparently solves. And sometimes that can be a really big challenge. What I would say is that the flip side to that answer is sometimes thinking through how a solution does or doesn't mesh with your current user base or customer base is really important when you conduct research, because you can very easily validate your concerns about the solution in a biased manner, right? Like you're like, oh, well, our customers aren't gonna use this. Well, maybe there's a new market we could tackle, and maybe we have to be very selective about who we talk to about this idea, because there is an opportunity here that we just don't know about.
I think both of those are very interesting. I think for us, we really have two different segments of users. And so to James's point, again, I think when you're interviewing one, I love your example, it was perfect, but when you're interviewing one kind of segment of users, know that maybe some of the learnings that you're taking away from that discovery may not apply to other segments of users. So understanding kind of subpopulations maybe within your user base also. That wasn't what I was going to say though, but now I'm forgetting. What was I going to say?
It'll come back to you.
It might.
All right. My next question really has to do with ongoing research. So I know that sometimes, like we said before, generative, evaluative. I feel like a lot of what we've talked about so far is evaluative. I'm so sorry. Does somebody want to grab that? Okay. Maybe it's upstairs. It's in the ceiling. All right. We're gonna keep powering through. So we've talked a decent amount about evaluative research. It feels right. We have a specific problem. We're trying to figure out, is it the right user to talk to understand that problem? Let's talk a little bit more about generative research. I'd love to know if there are specific things that you've done in the past to ensure that there is consistent generative research going on in the background. One tip that I haven't been able to implement yet, but I heard a couple of weeks ago, was a woman talking about how on her customer-facing website, she has a place where customers can sign up for user office hours. There's an incentive, usually like a free product, a free, couple months of subscription or whatever. And so she has a slot, it's like 2 hours every other Thursday, where she just hangs out and sees if users sign up. And she always has that generative research happening in the background. I think it's awesome, right? It's people who want to be there. You don't really get to select who it is, but I thought that was a really good example of a type of generative research tactic. Cool. Any you want to share?
Yeah, I'll go super tactical. We dog food, or we use our own product a lot. And so in the past, I've done internal stakeholder office hours once a month and talk to developers, talk to our quality folks about how they're using the product. The caveat is your use case is not the only use case. Don't just solve for your own. So take that with a grain of salt. I think B2C, that tactic is great. You could always fly something out, offer $5 or Starbucks or something. It's a great way to talk to customers. If you're lucky enough to have a regular NPS or a post-purchase survey, we have both, fortunately, ask customers if they want follow-up. Get those verbatims, and then you can slot them into the right product person. That's a great way that we do continuous discovery, always trying to talk to customers.
I'll add from the enterprise, for the enterprise folks in the room, I'm actually a little bit more experienced on the enterprise side, so I'll talk about popping in on sales calls all the time, which, our salespeople love. But, just asking questions like, hey, how's this new feature working for you? Did you notice any bugs that you wanted to call out? I'm here to be of service to you, customer. And being the one who is in the room as the expert, it provides a sort of white glove experience for enterprise customers. And it does also support the sales team in a way that is always kind of tenuous and hard sometimes especially at startups where there's a lot of tension between sales and marketing and product.
I'll go pretty tactical too. So something interesting that we've discovered as a B2B SaaS platform is during onboarding is a really great time. So new customer onboarding has been a really interesting time for generative types of discovery for us. And specifically one way that we have found to do that is during onboarding or even subsequently when users are asking for questions, maybe about how to do something in the product, is actually having them screen share. This is very specific. Having them actually screen share and walk us through the problem that they're trying to solve in the product. This has been really informative because you get to see that sort of behavior and actually ends up generating some really interesting ideas. I think one thing about users is, most people are very intelligent. They're trying to solve a problem in your product. And so if they're telling you things, maybe and kind of pushing this information, they're sometimes trying to solve that with an implementation mindset. But when you're doing this kind of working session together, it ends up generating a lot of interesting ideas, I think, in a more collaborative fashion. So one idea.
Great. James, one thing that you touched on was surveys. So I love and hate surveys because the data that you get is directly related to the quality of the questions that you ask, especially if they are leading questions. I would love to know if there are any gotchas around surveys, specifically ones that relate to user research. So whether that's CSAT, NPS, kind of the more classic ones, or ones that you're coming up with more custom.
I think it goes back to that buyer versus user persona. A lot of times it's the buyer who's taking that survey, not the actual user. So how they hear problems from the users may not always actually translate into an opportunity that you can go tackle.
So this is a very specific example, but I think it answers your question really well, which is that leading with a solution sometimes happens, especially in startups when you're trying to move quickly. We led with a solution recently at Everly, and it was a discounted test. Sign up to get a consult and you'll get a discounted test. So some of the questions that we asked in our user research surveys, not in our actual research interviews, was would you be motivated to sign up for a consult if you got a discount on a test? And it's okay, well, you have to consider, no one will say no to a 25% off discount on a test, right? So the context in which you ask the questions, the fact that our primary value proposition is the diagnostic at-home physical test kit, not the consult. Yeah, I want that thing that you guys are known for. If it means going through this consult process, then yeah, sure, whatever. But if you're gonna give me 25% off, I'm very interested. We had a lot of leadership conversations about how some of the questions in that survey were a little bit biased because of that.
I have a regret actually related to that, related to NPS specifically. So something that we discovered was that we had maybe waited too long, even as an early stage startup, to start asking that NPS question, even in just a very simple format. And what was interesting is when we started asking that, we found that our users just wanted to give us feedback. They actually wanted more frequent check-ins. And so in some ways, a very simple survey you can kind of frame it as a way for those users to be able to give you feedback. And in exchange, they'll give you very candid feedback, which is very valuable from a product discovery perspective, right?
Great. One other thing that I've definitely noticed in my career is when a company is very, very grateful and pro user research and kind of that regular discovery cycle. It wasn't until I got to a company that it was very obvious that they valued it. They showed it by doing a weekly demo of just UX research. So the UX team did a demo every week to kind of help inform the rest of the teammates what they had learned, how it was going to impact the work that they were doing. It was really cool. I would love to know if there's anybody in the audience here that you all can help if they're at a company that doesn't currently value user research, or maybe doesn't value it as much as they would like. How do they get a company to kind of see that value more clearly?
I have the real analytical answer that I'm going to give so that hopefully there are better answers actually, because I think naively you would probably think to go to the company and say, well, this is actually going to save us time and money in the long run. And so that would be probably instinctively my first answer in that position. So I would love to hear from the other panelists what their responses would be, I guess, to that, or better answers.
I actually went through this recently with the same example. So we had an idea. We were really excited about the idea. We were trying to figure out like what features to build to like make the consult appealing, and to actually like give value to the user in the end. One of the things that we talked about was scheduling on-demand consultations with a provider versus scheduled consults with a provider. And it turned out through some technical feasibility conversations that the on-demand flow became like really unwieldy, and we'd effectively be like building two different experiences entirely. We bumped that data up against our user research, and it turned out that like actually no one was very interested in on-demand at all. Like they wanted the flexibility of being able to like maneuver around their like schedules and their lives, and like on-demand in theory sounds like really sexy and interesting, but like no one was interested. So we quantified like the number of sprints it would take to build on demand and assign that a dollar value, and then like use that as an argument to be like, we could have built this thing that no one wanted, but we didn't. We saved $500,000 or whatever the number was.
Yeah, if you're trying to show value for user research and really build out that skill, start with support. They talk to customers every day. They screen share with customers. A lot of us are probably software product managers. They're going to be able to tell you, is this going to actually solve a problem for the customer? Is this match their workflow? So you can start there and say, hey, we could have released this. Support would have yelled. 2 weeks later, we could have actually released the thing that solved the customer problem, but we shaved that 2 weeks off because we started there. If we could do user research before, we would do this every cycle. And you can build the muscle that way, I think.
A good follow-up question there is, are there any like unexpected or maybe less obvious partners that you found within your company who can give you that really good user insight?
I don't know if this is directly answering the question, but awesome. So I was going to say, actually, I think all of those things or the two examples that we just heard were good retrospective examples, prospective ways to maybe demonstrate this kind of value, and then to Allegra's question just now, I think get to what you just said about the mock-ups and wireframes and actually being able to use. So I think design is a really good partner to work with, where you could design some mock-ups. I try to do that, and then I'll just show customers, Figma mock-ups or something, and kind of walk them through, like, would this be intuitive to you? So I think being able to do that really early on is useful.
I'd say don't forget about your engineers. They're really smart, and actually one of mine, my former one, is in the room here, so I have to say this. No, I'm just kidding. It's so important to talk to the people doing the work, even if it feels like, oh, well, they should be focused on this. Pulling them in to be like, okay, you've probably thought about this problem more intimately than a lot of us. What do you think we should do to solve X problem? Just don't forget about them. They're really smart.
Cool. One other thing that I have struggled with, and I'm sure everyone in the room has struggled with in some way, is knowing when research is enough research, especially about a specific problem, a specific feature, whatever that might be. How do you know when you have done enough? And a follow-up question is, if there is somebody on your team who is very pro-research and you feel is doing way too much research, how do you as the product manager have that hard conversation to say, hey, I think we're good?
Set your limits beforehand, identify what questions specifically you want to answer, and get comfortable with failure. Because a lot of times you're going to ask a question, think it's a great idea. Users are going to tell you you're wrong. That's not what they want. That's not what they care about. And you learn something. Celebrate those wins of, we didn't launch something we shouldn't have. That's how you really show the value, I think, is how much did we save by not launching something, not investing the time to go build that thing.
Great. Another question, Mary, I know you mentioned usertesting.com, which I know is a favorite, although I think it's getting like more expensive every month, every time I check. What other resources are out there for finding users, especially if you're looking for that direct-to-consumer B2C type user group?
So we leverage our lifecycle and retention marketing team quite a bit. They sort of conduct our marketing automation flows, like automated transactional emails or campaigns, et cetera. So Google Forms, turns out, is a really helpful way to screen people in and out of things that you want to, ask questions on. And they can also pull certain triggers, like because of the integrations that we have from our platform into the marketing automation tool. So like leveraging the teams that exist that are already talking to customers is really, really helpful. I can't think of like we use, DScout. If you guys know DScout, that's a really helpful tool. It's a really interesting sort of like integrated multi-part survey tool with like videos, asynchronous videos. It's really engaging, I think, for our user base, and it's really helpful.
Cool. This may be a question for somebody else in the audience. If none of you guys know, I'd be curious to know. We could talk after. Something that happened to me recently was diving into some data, and something looked really weird. Like the data looked really off. I talked to the data team. I was like, did something go down? I don't really understand what's going on here. And that created this like gigantic effort to talk to users to understand why that spike had happened. And what we ended up discovering was that the way that we were actually tracking that data was completely incorrect. We were like looking at the wrong parameter. It was kind of a cool opportunity where it was like the users told us something about our system that was working in a way we didn't expect. I'd love to know if there's like something similar that's happened to you all, where maybe you learned something completely unexpected about your tech stack, about some bug from a conversation with a user.
I can't think of it. We recently had an issue with our Launch Darkly setup. We saw that like fewer or more, I can't remember which it was, users were accessing the product. We were using Launch Darkly to like rate the product based on like a percentage release. So we realized that the way that we had implemented Launch Darkly was like completely different from the way that we assumed it was set up, based on like how many users were actually accessing the product. So we had enough metrics and monitoring in place to like understand that, but it wasn't necessarily with the user.
Cool. That also leans into feature flagging or ways in which you kind of gate or segment customers. I'd love to hear some examples of times that you saw that done really, really well, and maybe times where you saw it go not so well, trying to set that up so you could do user research effectively.
So I've been lucky to be at orgs that have their own built-in feature flagging. So as a product person, you get the data right away. As long as you can query the database, you can see how are the two different versions running, and you got to make the call of when does it roll out. I think the caveat there is always think about like at what level do we say, yes, that's good, and no, we're going to roll it back. And think about that beforehand, because it's really easy to say, oh, it's going to get there, oh, it's going to get there, oh, it's going to get there. And 3 months later, you still have this feature flag in your code that's creating all of these divergent paths, and it's just a mess to clean up later.
I have a bit of a meta answer to that, which actually gets to business model, how product discovery can sort of influence business model also. So some of the feature flagging that we were doing in our scientific platform is around experiment types, and the way that we were selling annual subscriptions was based on, or is currently still based on, number of experiment types, which you can think of as number of buttons in the app. And what we were finding actually is that when people started getting in the platform and then using the experiment types that they had purchased, they just wanted to add more experiment types immediately. They said, oh, well, I'm actually doing this kind of experiment and this one also, and I just want to keep adding that. And that's an interesting case there because we had built out these feature flags so that we could just, divvy up different experiment types between customers. But now actually some of this product discovery is telling us that we might need to explore different business models than this upfront annual B2B subscription if users really are getting in and saying, hey, this was a feature flag that you set up, but now I want to, kind of change that because we've given them that peak.
Cool. I'm going to shift gears just a little bit to more maybe soft skills, people skills type question. So something that I've seen a lot in my career as a product management consultant, recently worked with a lot of different companies that had a lot of different setups. There's a lot of tension between product and UX in a lot of these companies. There's a lot of toes being stepped on. I hear that all the time, or heard that all the time. I'd love to know kind of what you guys have done in the past to ensure that you're not stepping on UX's toes if you have that team member on your team, making sure that you're still involved in that research, but also letting them do what they do best.
I'll start. Something that we try to do as a team is ask a lot of questions and avoid using assumption kind of language. So saying something like, well, can't we just do this? Or can't we just do that? Because that's potentially making an assumption that the UX hasn't done the research, or maybe you're thinking the engineering implementation might be easier than you're imagining. So those would be my 2 tips.
I've actually collaborated with UX designers differently depending on the UX designer. And sometimes tickets, like Jira tickets, are like a preference to communicate like what key question we're trying to tackle. And sometimes it's just like a quick sync. So like defining what style works best with the UX designer that you're working with is definitely one of my biggest tips. I would also say that like instead of, I find myself falling into the trap of like illustrating exactly the requirements from a UX perspective in those tickets when we are using tickets. And sometimes that's not helpful because it feels like I'm trying to dictate exactly what the UX should look like. Instead, what I've done before is like key question, hypothesis, competitors to look at, like sort of like steer or shape, but not dictate. So that's my second advice.
From a research perspective, we use discussion guides to guide those interviews that maybe I'm going to lead or maybe the product designer is going to lead. And we really break out what's the research question we're trying to answer and what's the interview question that we'll ask. And we talk about why are we asking these things? What do we want to learn? And so that helps us together collaborate and ground on what's the real purpose for this. And then it doesn't matter who runs the interview. We're in agreement on what we're trying to solve for. And then super tactically, I just want the green button. Can't you just make the green button? No, I'm just kidding. I like to set guardrails for both engineers and UX and say, here's why we need to solve this problem. Here's how big it is. Can we do it in one sprint, one iteration, whatever it is? Yeah, I think competitors to look at is fantastic. I'm going to steal that. Of here's how the other guys do it. Tell me why it sucks and make ours better.
Great. I think we'll round out our panel questions with our title question, which has to do with regrets. So I think that there's all of those quotes out there about you only really learn when you're failing, which is very true. I'd love to know of kind of examples of maybe current job, past jobs where you've made a big mistake doing product discovery and what you learned from that.
Like, it's me. Okay. At a past job, I was at Health Grades, which is just down the street. I think they're called something else now, a couple of years ago. And we were working on an enterprise CRM platform where we had to design like some sort of client to enterprise hierarchy, very back-end feature problem. The enterprise, let's call it like New York Presbyterian Hospital, wanted to see all their like ambulatory clinics. They wanted to see all the data in place. We assumed wrongly that the ambulatory clinics were all like broken out by region cleanly, that, so Jill in marketing was responsible for one region and therefore would only need access to this one region so that she could see her ambulatory clinics in Kansas. Wrong. What we built was to define, like to tackle that use case. And of course, we didn't talk to enough customers. We didn't understand the structures at these like really complex health systems that are multi-state, that are multi-region, that have like different reasons for seeing the data. And we just didn't get the full breadth and complexity of the problem. I think in retrospect, it was probably because it was such a technical feat that we were like over-indexing on like how difficult the technology was to solve for, that we were like, okay, we get it, marketing department, we've got this, and sort of solving a problem in a silo without talking to other customers. So many regrets.
I think I touched on my regret earlier of make sure you have the right user for the actual problem you want to solve.
Thanks. No, I was just going to go back to what I was saying about subsets or subpopulations of users. So exactly that. It was, just make sure that, which you kind of spoke to a little bit also, make sure you're talking to the right person. I think we can easily build in a bubble. For Pluto, we were founded out of an academic institute, and so we started solving a lot of problems that we found actually academics sort of bring on themselves potentially. And so that's really useful to continue solving those problems for them. But some of the problems that we were solving that we assumed would be problems outside of academic institutes actually weren't. Or people said, oh no, we already have a solve for that. And it really changed how we had to kind of learn on the fly and alter our messaging. So.
Great. Thanks, you guys. We'd love to open it up to you all. Any questions about product discovery that our panelists or myself can answer for you? Yeah.
Thanks. Y'all used the term generative discovery. I'd never heard that before, but have heard continuous. Do you see those as like synonymous, or are they different? Synonymous?
Yeah, I would say they're very, very similar. You may be able to evaluate as you're continually discovering, but it's very generative in nature, where you're going to start to hear new problems based on new features that released, or market is changing underneath you, and maybe that's going to be the first you hear about it.
Awesome, thank you.
Any other questions? That's okay.
How do you avoid bias or predisposition when you're doing research?
Talk to a lot of people. I mean, like in earnest, that's probably a really good place to start. I think like it depends on your product. I've been having conversations with folks around like data science products where like there's machine learning and there's a data set that you're trying to train against, and like that's a completely different like bias problem. So I think it differs based on like the product, problem, market that you're trying to solve for, or the space that you're existing in. But I think like as broad a sample size as possible. Even if it feels like maybe this person wouldn't use your product, you never know. And like, it's better to throw out ideas than it is to like, actively avoid them, essentially.
I think for us, is anybody familiar with the mom test? The book, The Mom Test? I think fresh conversations with new people and avoiding mentioning, for example, like I built this product, or, I have a potential solution, versus starting with questions is really helpful for avoiding then bias in the answers. Because I also think when you're doing these kinds of interviews, and especially for myself as a founder or as a fellow scientist, people will be like, oh, trying to relate and trying to think, clearly you've done some research here, you might have a good solution, and then they won't give you as candid of feedback. So I think fresh conversations don't lead with a solution and sort of don't reveal your role in the interview process too, and try to be as unbiased yourself as possible too.
I'll double tap on the DScout tool for this too. I think it's easier to like say no to something when you're by yourself with your phone than it is to say no in front of someone who has ties to a company, like kind of building on the mom test. DScout's really awesome. Like you could just be like, well, I don't know that I'd use this. This is kind of crap, and like you never have to answer to anyone. It's just a recorded thing that you can kind of use later.
If you're not using DScout and you're actually talking to people, they want to tell you about how their ideal workflow works. So made up example, how often do you do yoga? Oh, I definitely do it 3 times a week. Tell me about the last time you did it. Oh, is it March? Like, ask them about the last time, a specific time, because then you get real workflow, not ideal workflow.
One thing a little bit further up the funnel too that I've done, mentor taught me this a number of years ago and I've never let it go. When you start a research project, list out your biases. Like put it on a piece of paper or on a Miro board in today's day and age of like, I believe X, or I am biased in this way, or I relate to this user because X. And if you put it in front of you, especially on a team, if you all like take 10 minutes to kind of write out your own biases, it's amazing how other people think about the same project. And then you can kind of, in a safe space, call each other out if there are those leading questions, if people do kind of have these preconceived notions, especially if everyone on the team has the same bias. That is like a huge, red stoplight. Go and talk to somebody else in the company who might have a different view to make sure that you're kind of covering all of your bases.
This one's for Mary. I'm coming for you. Um, Speaking of bias, one of the things we know can be really hard is if you're in enterprise and you're working with a sales team who may or may not be using like Challenger, they're supposed to come with a solution. They're supposed to come with, we know how to solve your problem. How do you work well with a sales team when you really need them to not come with a solution?
Sometimes it's humoring them. I'll like real talk. Like sometimes it's like, okay, what's your idea? Let's hear it. Like literally. And sometimes it's good. Other times, like I think like walking, once you get it out in the open, you can kind of be like, okay, well, what if we did this? And then it becomes more of a conversation and less of a like, I think your idea is bad. Let's move on. I'm a big believer. I don't believe that consensus is required at every step in the flow, right? Like as you're like working through like discovery, but I do believe that collaboration is required. And I turn those conversations into a collaborative opportunity and a trust building opportunity to show that like I'm a partner in this and I'm not trying to say no to every idea you come up with. I just want to like pick it apart a little bit and then show you my ideas and then we can come to a conclusion.
Jump into that one. I always want to know what's the competitor that has that feature, and we can usually map to that and understand what's the actual problem they want to solve. Because what I found, at least 9 times out of 10, somebody's asking for a specific feature because that's how they do it today, and that's what they're used to. Well, what if we cut 3 steps out of that process for you with the feature we already have built? That's just way better. But you have to ask hard questions and sometimes get in there and talk to the customer about it.
Just because I'm close. So very classical startup problem. People in an industry go and create a startup to solve problems in an industry, and they're customers. They know the problem. And it's just, I'm kind of curious, as you think about user research, how you try and convince your internal users that they're not as wise or as smart as your actual customers. I find it's something I struggle with daily because they literally are my customers, but there's 5 of them and there's 2 million of the actual people outside the door.
Something I've said a lot lately is like data is the tonic to like solve that problem. But of course, if you can't get the data, then you're kind of stuck, right? Like if I can't get the data to prove to you that like other people think differently, then like how do I maneuver out of this? I would say if it's making your life and your job difficult, carve out the time for it and like take your product manage your day. Take your list of priorities for the day, stick in user research, do it off the side of your desk because sometimes it can be really, really enlightening. Other times, like, I've been proven wrong before. It happens. And sometimes you're wrong, right? But I think without data, it becomes really hard to have a conversation that's productive.
To add to that, I was going to say seeing is believing. And so I think seeing is, data is a big part of that. Even just watching, anytime you have the opportunity to watch your users interact with the app, what we like to remind ourselves as a team of is that, the things that do seem very easy to us and straightforward in the app, if we have data, if we have session monitoring, if we have error alerting, you can see that users are running into issues where we don't run into those issues, internally. And so that makes it very real. Or even just watching, if anybody's familiar with LogRocket or other kinds of session monitoring, watching somebody and actually timing, users, as they're going through the process, you can see very clearly it might take us 2 seconds to do something in the app. Clearly, this user is taking much longer. And so I think just seeing is believing. And so data or qualitatively too.
I'm curious. Sorry, I'm feedback. I'm curious for each of your product teams, or just your team if it's smaller, how many customer touch points, interviews, whether generative or evaluative, do you expect each of your product managers to have on any given week? And also, then, how many would you actually like them to have?
I hate this answer, but it depends. It depends on where we are. I've been working almost exclusively on greenfield products. So it's kind of like at the beginning of like an innovation session where we're like, okay, we think we know what problem we need to solve. Let's talk to people. There's like a big sort of like upfront distribution of users that we talk to. I think in those generative conversations, we talk to anywhere between like 10 and 15 users per product manager in that phase. So maybe like 5 to 7 a week. And like, I'm thinking like maybe 3 or 4 product managers all working on the same sort of problem set. But like throughout the life cycle of a product, I think we try to rely on processes like user testing, Dscout, et cetera, like more asynchronous, so that the product managers have time to work on things with engineering a little bit more and UX.
More, always more. I'm going to throw out an audacious number, and we try to get somewhere between 20 and 50 interactions with customers in a week. But I'm going to caveat that with open roadmap. I interacted with a dozen customers this morning before I came here in issues, asking a question, answering a question, whatever it might have been. Those weren't 30-minute conversations. Those were 30-second typing out an answer. But those count, and those are valuable. And you see other workflows that maybe you're not used to. When it comes to actual interviews, we strive for at least one a week, whether that's research that you're doing, a follow-up survey, or you got pulled into a customer call. All of those are touch points.
Any other questions? Oh, can you hear me? Yes. Okay.
This one? Okay. Yep. So you brought up user segmentation. Wondering if you're conducting any studies around accessibility. So, if those customers are top of mind. So customers who use screen readers or anything else.
This is another good time to use the more answer. So more is definitely needed. In our product specifically, we think a lot about color blindness and how that's affecting especially scientific figure generation, because we know for scientific figures it's very important to convey different groups on a plot, for example. And same thing, even if we don't think about color blindness, but people are often printing those figures and maybe printing in black and white. So that's I think where we are starting to scratch the surface, but certainly want to do more for the screen reader and others.
We recently did a usability audit through a company whose name I cannot think of, but I think we could probably do a lot more to talk to users about usability from like an accessibility standpoint, but we don't do that very often.
So we're lucky enough to have a foundations team that has built out the library of UI components, which accelerates development because everything's reusable, but also they're singularly focused on, or one of their focuses, I should say, is accessibility. And so they're thinking about that. And red-green is a huge one. Pipelines failing, pipelines passing, just colors don't work. So they're always thinking about that and how do we indicate upward trends, downward trends, failure, success, something in between.
I think speaking to segmentation as well, I worked with a company that it was a communication company, and most of their users were deaf. about 90% of their users were deaf. One thing that I learned there that I was really appreciative of is the deaf community is not just one community. There are thousands of different types of users within that community. So that's obviously a more traditional type of accessibility requirement. Don't be afraid to ask those users how they would segment their own communities. I think that that's something that people are sometimes afraid to do. I learned so much specifically about the deaf community, but also things like colorblindness. There's different types of colorblindness, and who knows better than those users, of course, if they're comfortable talking about it, but definitely a goldmine of information.
So we are a startup, 50 people, entire product and engineering. I'm basically building the product team, coming from engineering, and very similar to his question around having internal stakeholders who very much know the industry. I myself know the industry really well. Slowing down enough or convincing other people to slow down enough to do more of this. Versus sometimes you just need to go fast, especially when you are a small company and trying to get, balancing revenue, like, sales and CEO and everybody screaming for revenue, and balancing that against slowing down to make sure you're actually doing the things that will bring the revenue. Any stories, examples, thoughts around that?
This happened literally this morning, very timely. I'm in healthcare, health tech, and I've been in healthcare my whole career, so all 10, almost 11 years of it. It's funny, like, what you take for granted as like a subject matter expert. It's like, oh, well, like, what's an EHR? Oh, I guess that's a good question. It means electronic health record, right? Like, sometimes you even have to go to like that fundamental level where you're like, okay, these are the acronyms that are used. Like, this is the situation we're in. What happened this morning is that we had a situation where there were requirements on a screen and someone from our clinical department was like sharing requirements. And they were like, we need this, we need that, we need this. And we had our engineering lead, our product lead, and me on the phone. So like our VP of product, CTO. And they just didn't get it. Like, they didn't understand why the clinical team needed these things. And so like instantly I was like in the chat being like, hey guys, I think we need like a layer above what we're talking about right now. We're talking about clinical requirements to have like a patient portal where like patients can send messages to their provider. Like when there aren't folks who have been like ingrained in the industry or subject matter experts, you kind of have to be like, okay, well, here are the problems we're solving. Like, step back from the requirements. We weren't even at a solutions phase. It was just like, okay, well, we need something that does X. We need something that does Y. We need to talk about the problems we're trying to solve and what opportunities this unlocks and why it's important, not like a rundown list of requirements. So just a little anecdote. I don't know if that answers your question.
For us, I mean, we're in that situation every week by week. Every Monday sprint planning, we're in that situation. And I think having an open dialogue with the team about, getting more voices involved, especially from engineering or design, to say, hey, here is what we're hearing from users as a top priority. As a business, do we have the time? Do we have the resources to try to tackle that? I think the thing about discovery is it's going to be iterative, right? We know, and so maybe the answer to a previous question of how much discovery is enough is, for us as a very small startup, is when you feel like you haven't done quite enough, because you do have to continue shipping things, right? But it's really difficult. And the other thing about discovery is you might be doing all of this great discovery and then know that your priorities do have to change as a business. So even if you feel like you have a really strong direction that you have to go, it's really hard as a small startup to prioritize, new revenue. And so something, for B2B, we're able to pretty directly map a new feature development, to new revenue. So that's another angle that you can take too, if it's helpful.
I really think it's the responsibility of product folks to slow down, to make sure that you're taking the time to actually look into that weird data or follow up on that strange lead. A lot of innovation comes from that. New product market fit comes from that. I do a curiosity carve out. I know it's dorky, but I've been doing it for years. It's about an hour every Monday morning before people can Slack me and email me, where I try and go after those weird leads, or I think about that was that weird customer call that we had. They had this like funky idea. Maybe I should look into what they were talking about. I think that that's something that can be helpful to slow down, is just dedicate that time and then get people excited about what those new findings might mean, especially if it means new revenue, right? New opportunities for that. One other way that I've definitely cured the subject matter expert to your question too is I have an uncle. He lives in Vermont. He has not used the internet in maybe 30 years, and I talked to him about what we're building, and it's fascinating because he has such a different perspective. He would have no idea what EHR stands for at all, right? And maybe he's not the target audience, but it's really helped me to also slow down in those senses of, I understand this, I'm an expert here, what do my users probably not understand? And it would shock you what like doesn't immediately come to mind for somebody who somehow hasn't used the internet in 30 years. Great. Cool. I think that's our time. I'd like to thank our panelists. Thank you so much for being here. Cool. Great. Cool. Thank you. And thanks, Den, for Startup Week.